All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and for the lovely introduction. I know I've got a bit of an ambitious title. We're going to think about how to create sustainable, just, and caring cities in 15 minutes. But I hear that you come here and fix problems, so that's great. I heard that April is transit month, yes. Right? Yeah. Okay. Woo! I'm a transport nerd. I'm really interested in transportations for a lot of reasons, but one of the main things that drives me is how the role of the transport sector needs to play in our climate mitigation. In this room, I think there's a lot of transport nerds, so you probably know this already, but global CO2 emissions from the transport sector are actually a pretty significant part of our global emissions. This graph here shows the emissions over the transport sector over time. And it only starts in 2000. You can see a wonderful dip that we had a few years ago from COVID, and everyone went, oh, the transport sector's changed. We're low carbon now. Everything's great. And then boom, we're all the way right back up. What we need to do to get to net zero is what you see on that final bar on the right. So we have a long way to go. And sadly, not only is the transport sector one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels, it's also one of the few that's still growing. It accounts for approximately 30% of CO2 emissions from end-use sectors. And this doesn't have to be this way. There are parts of the world where it's a lot lower, but sadly in Canada, and in Ontario, that's where about 30% of our emissions are coming from. So I'm really motivated to reduce that graph. And my focus is really on that light blue area, which is the big area, which is road transport. There we go. And I really focus in on cities. So some of you might have, thought of this yourselves or come across this, but there's this idea in cities that we need to follow what we call a sustainable transport hierarchy, where you make the most sustainable modes of travel the easiest modes and the most convenient modes. And then it's not that you get rid of the other modes, that you just make them a little less easy, the less sustainable that they get. So it's about promoting things like walking and then cycling and public transport, and at the last resort, having private vehicles as the vehicles that we make easy to use around our cities. Sorry, told me to unmute and that was a mistake. I'm done. You'll stop hearing that. There's two screens, it's confusing. So we know we need to do this transition towards more sustainable modes. We know that's really important for road transportation. We know that we should be doing this in cities. We should be promoting things like walking and cycling and public transit use. And cities are really finally taking an effort to actually make that happen. Toronto, as its climate action strategy, aims that 75% of its trips will be made by sustainable travel modes by 2040, which is pretty soon. But currently, even for short trips, so in the city of Toronto, 45% of all the trips are less than 5 kilometers long, which is pretty short. That's kind of the distance that people say you can bike. It's definitely the distance you can transit, and if you combine with walking. These are the trips we should really be aiming at being easy ones to convert to more sustainable travel modes. And of 45% of all Toronto's trips are made that short. So these should be the easy ones. This should be easy. We shouldn't have a hard time doing this. And yet of these, 65 are made by private car. So we have even these short trips that should be really easy to do using sustainable transport modes that are still being made by private car in the city of Toronto. And why is it so hard to make those short trips by sustainable travel mode? I'm going to argue that part of the reason might be because a lot of those trips are what we call mobility of care trips. Mobility of care trips are all of the travel that's required to upkeep a home. These are all the trips you do to go grocery shopping, to escort your children or your elderly dependents if you have them. They're to go to health appointments or to run errands. These are trips that tend to be shorter, tend to be close to the home, and I'm going to be argued are systematically underrepresented in transportation surveys and research. Now I'm going to argue it. Who here in this room has heard about the Transportation Tomorrow survey? Who here loves the Transportation Tomorrow survey? It is. It's like the best survey. It's the best. It's so good. It's so big. And the U of T lets me use it for free. Thank you so much. Transportation Tomorrow survey is one of the biggest travel surveys like in the world. It's definitely the biggest in North America. It happens every 5 years. It surveys a huge amount of people in the greater Golden Horseshoe. So Toronto, Hamilton, where I am, is included. Yes. It does a travel diary. So it asks everybody, where did you go over the course of a few days? What time did you leave? Who was with you? How did you get there? It's really good data. But I'd like to show you in ways it's not great data. So to get you engaged, I'd like you all to write down on your phone or on your computer or on a piece of paper everywhere you traveled to over the past 3 days. So we're Tuesday. So if you think of Sunday, Monday, and today so far, everywhere you went, can you write it down? This is what the TTS would ask you to do every 5 years. Tell me everywhere you went. Even you two. I know I invited you, but I want you to write it down. Everyone has a phone. Everywhere you went over 3 days. Yes. If you want to. I'm not going to be that fancy, but if you want to. Did you go for a walk? I'm sure a lot of you went out for the eclipse. Did you go to work? Did you go to school? Did you get groceries? Did you see a friend? And I'm only going to give you another 20 seconds. Okay, you might not have everything, but you've probably written down most of the places you've been in the past 3 days. Now, if you were to respond to the Transportation Tomorrow survey, what you'd be asked to do is write down your origin and destination for each of those trips. Your options are here on this slide. Your options are either home, first work trip of the day, second and subsequent work trips, first school trip of the day, second and subsequent school trips, facilitate passenger, marketing, shopping, not 1991, daycare, and unknown. So for each of those trips you wrote down, can you write down the number for your origin and your destination? So for example, on Monday, if I went to work into the grocery store, I went from home, which is 1, to work, which is 2. From groceries to work would be work to shopping, 2 to 7. And from shopping to home would be shopping to home, 7 to 1. I know you weren't expecting homework. I apologize. We're doing homework. Okay, you probably didn't finish, but did anybody struggle to do any of their trips? Yes. What trip did you struggle with? Spike ball? So what did you put it under? Okay. Unknown? Yeah?
I like walked here. I was like, what am I doing here?
Yeah, what are you, so it's kind of school, but it's not school. But yeah, okay, that's a good one. Anyone else? So unknown? Yeah. Anyone else? Leisure, I guess. Yeah, but that's not an option. So unknown. Yes. Okay. I'd have a side note on it. They're pretty good at multimodal trips, but that's a side note that's unrelated. The point is that a lot of trips are actually quite difficult to capture using the survey. And again, I love the survey. It's the best. Please U of T, don't hear me while I'm here and stop giving me access. I love the survey. I do a lot with it. But some trips are actually very hard to categorize using the survey, including care trips. Care trips are kind of challenging to capture using the survey. If you're, for example, dropping your child off at daycare or school, there is a facilitate passenger, which is clearly like I'm escorting my child, but there's also daycare and there's also school. So you don't really know which one of the 3 to use. If you're going grocery shopping, you're under the same categories if you're going shopping for fun. I don't actually find shopping fun, but a lot of people do, and that's leisure. That's a very different kind of trip than if you're shopping because you have to for sustenance. If you're visiting an older relative to help them clean their home, that's definitely unknown. If you're just visiting a friend, that's unknown. If you're going to a hospital appointment, that's unknown. And beyond that, it's not just that the categories don't capture all these different care trips, but a lot of care trips are also short. So when people like me are doing data cleaning, they're the ones we remove right away because we're like, well, they're not important because they're short. Like, let's look at the longer trips, right? Okay, yeah, you're not, yeah, you've done it. No more after today. The problem with mobility of care is that our surveys don't capture them well. And yet, when you estimate how many trips are actually done for care, or when other people have gone out and measured these trips, it turns out that they actually comprise a huge proportion of our daily travel. This is work that I did using the version of the survey that we have in Montreal, back when I was a postdoc in Montreal, and looking at adults, which granted tend to do more care than children, but 28% of Montrealers' trips are for care purposes. Come on in, come on in. 28%. That is a huge amount of people's trips. That's almost a third of your trips are for care purposes. And yet the way that we measure our transportation now means that they get completely ignored. This is what the ARTM, the public transit agency around Montreal, uses to demonstrate how people make their trips in Montreal. They'll be, look at this, 48% of trips are to work, 17% are for this, 12% are for that. And when you plan around that, you really think, well, we just need to plan around work. But if you actually consider care trips, you see that there are a huge chunk of trips that shouldn't be ignored when we're planning for sustainable travel. And there are implications to ignoring these types of trips. The first one is that there's a big equity issue with ignoring these trips. Here on these graphs, orange refers to women and blue refers to men. Women do more care trips than men. It's a more significant part of their daily life than men's. So there's definitely a gendered element to who does these trips. This is especially the case in low-income families. This graph here, again, we're using Montreal. It starts off with households that make less than $30,000 a year. And as you move along, it goes higher. And you see, again, that gap is much higher in low-income households. It narrows down, although it's still present, statistically significant and present in higher-income households. But you have a much higher gap, gender gap, in who does this travel in lower-income households. So it's an equity issue in terms of gender, but also in terms of income. Montreal does not ask about race, so we don't know. Toronto doesn't either, but they're about to, so that's good. So I can't speak to that yet. And there's also some sustainability implications to care trips. This is, again, working off of Montreal's data. But if you're to estimate care trips and compare them to work trips, you see that care trips are more frequently done by car and by foot, and less frequently done by public transport and by cycling. Public transport is quite big. If you look at the city of Montreal, 18.7% of work trips are done by transit, and only 5.8% are done by for care. So people really don't use transit for care. But that's not quite true. Low-income women use transit for care. Low-income women tend to be more transit reliant. They don't have necessarily access to a car. So they're using transit even if transit does not serve care. This graph here shows household income and gender differences. And you see you've got not only a higher proportion of both men and women who use public transport in lower income households, but that gap between women and men who use it is really big in low income households. So low income women are transit reliant for care trips. A lot of them are. So I hope that what you take away from this is that the TTS is excellent, but it's not perfect. It's not great at capturing things like coming here. But more importantly, it's not great at capturing care trips. Care trips are significant. They're actually a big proportion of daily life. They're an essential travel too. We die without groceries and healthcare and stuff. Like, that's important. They're not for fun. Women do them, particularly low-income women, and they seem to be easier to do by car and by foot than by public transport and by cycling. They're also short. So these are trips that, if we did plan for them, I think could really make a difference in terms of the carbon footprint of our transport sector in cities. And as a final note, before you all go and solve this problem for me, you see this everywhere once you start looking for it. This is Hamilton, my city, where I live now. In that orange star is one of the biggest grocery stores in the city, Fortino's. The blue lines are the bicycle infrastructure, and the bicycle infrastructure just stops around the grocery store for some reason. Just stops. If you're taking the bus, those are the bus stops, and the closest ones. And this is what it looks like. So it's genuinely quite a far walk from the bus stop to get to that grocery store. If you do try to bus or bike, you have to cross this intersection on the right, which is one of the top 10 most dangerous intersections in Hamilton. We had like 22 pedestrian fatalities in 2019, and I think 3 of them were around. Like, it is not nice. The highway comes out here, terrible intersection. This is what you have to walk past if you are on the bus, and this is what you need to suddenly bike into if you're on your bike. And that's what the bike parking looks like, which makes me so mad. And this isn't necessarily a bad example. And these are all from Hamilton because this is where I live now. I didn't have time to go around Toronto today, but I had the same when I lived here. That's another grocery store. This is on 5 lanes of traffic. Yes, there's a bus stop, but there's no pedestrian crossing. So if I do take the bus, I have to kind of stand there and wait and run to get across a horrible, extremely car-centric parking lot. I could go on. Here's the last one. Here's another one. These are my 3 closest grocery stores, are all incredibly difficult to do care for using transit or walking. But I see people using transit and walking to these places. People are doing it, but we are giving them a disservice by not planning for care. So with that, I hope all of you transit nerds still love the TTS, but can be a little more critical about it. Nothing's perfect, right? But when you do plan for transportation, I think it's important to keep in mind that care is an important trip. It's one that we should be planning for. If anything, we should see this as an easy way to make our transport systems lower carbon, but there's also serious equity implications to ignoring it. So we should ask ourselves things like, where are we putting our bike lanes, our bus stops? Why isn't the bus going straight to the grocery store? Why is it so far? Where is our bike parking? Is it any good? Can it accommodate cargo bikes, which are better for care? And generally, I hope we can plan a sustainable city is also a caring city, one where we plan for care, but also importantly, reduce the gender discrepancy in who does the care, right? So it doesn't have to be women, and especially low-income women, that do these trips. Come on, you can do them too. So with that, I'd like to thank you for having me. And I'm not sure what happens next. I'm happy to answer questions, but you might be doing something else. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.